Pablo de Jesus, Executive Director of Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice. We feel deeply blessed to have two great speakers with us today. We're going to start the afternoon off with Adam Zipkin, currently serving as counsel to the United States Senator Cory Booker. And in this role, Adam advises Senator Booker on issues related to the environment, energy, agriculture, and animal welfare. Before he joined the senator's office, Adam was deputy mayor for economic development in the city of Newark, New Jersey, which I have to mention, I have a special love for Newark. I've come close about 5 times to living as a resident in Newark. And I've got family all throughout New Jersey, so I'm particularly happy about this briefing this morning or this afternoon. And prior to that, he was working in City Hall in Newark and operated a law firm primarily devoted to pro bono legal services to Newark residents in need, and with a focus on providing representation to low income.
Both days.
So he brings a wealth of roots in New Jersey, the senator's office, and a deep understanding of some of the issues that we're going to be discussing today. And
Pablo, we've lost your audio.
I'm sorry about that. I don't know how that happened, but I just want to get into the briefing. I don't know where you guys lost the audio on my end, but did we hear the introduction?
Yes, we did.
So with that, let's spotlight Adam and let him take over the show and tell us what we need to do and know about the topics at hand today.
Thank you so much, Pablo, Pablo, for the kind introduction. And I'm going to focus on 2 bills that Senator Booker has recently reintroduced: the Justice for Black Farmers Act and the Climate Stewardship Act. And the Justice for Black Farmers Act is a comprehensive bill that is meant to address the well-documented history of discrimination by the USDA, by the United States Department of Agriculture, against Black farmers. And so some of you may know, but there's this really terrible history that with the way that the federal government has treated Black farmers over the last century. And so in 1920, in the United States, there were nearly 1 million Black farmers, and they were almost 15% of all the farmers in our country. And today, there are less than 40,000 Black farmers, and they're only about 1% of the farmers in our country. And, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and USDA itself has done a lot of reports and sort of publicly admitted that a primary cause of this loss of Black farmers was due to intentional discrimination, intentional sort of systemic racism within USDA against Black farmers. And so over the last century, Black farmers have lost somewhere between 15 and 20 million acres of farmland and all the generational wealth that land represented to those Black farmers and their families. And so the bill has really 4 main pillars of what it would do. The first pillar is that it would attempt to put reforms in place within USDA to sort of once and for all end discrimination within the agency to the maximum extent that is possible. And so it would create a civil rights oversight board where if someone filed a civil rights complaint and they were not satisfied with the outcome, they could appeal to this independent civil rights oversight board. It would create an equity commission to look at all of the USDA statutes and regulations to try to see where there is still sort of a discriminatory impact in those laws or regulations. it would put a number of other reforms in place within the agency and within the Office of Civil Rights to try to, and not just to protect Black farmers moving forward, but to protect everyone. There's no place for discrimination in the activities of our federal agencies, and so this would attempt to address that. And some of what is in the bill, the agency doesn't need to wait for Congress to pass a bill telling them to do a lot of these things. They could just move forward and do them. And some of them, Secretary Vilsack and the new administration have already started to do. They're moving forward with creating an equity commission. They're moving forward with sort of analyzing discrimination within the agency and trying to root it out. The second pillar of the bill is an attempt to protect the remaining Black farmers from losing their land. There's this small percentage that have managed to hang on through the decades despite all the discrimination and despite everything. And the bill has a foreclosure moratorium to protect against the loss of land, and it has provisions to forgive the debt of those farmers. And one really sort of exciting part of what was in the $1.9 trillion COVID bill that was signed into law last month, Senator Booker and Senator Warnock, working with Chairman Scott in the House and Senator Stabenow, were able to get debt forgiveness for Black farmers and other farmers of color, other socially disadvantaged farmers. So Indigenous farmers, Latino farmers, that debt, Congress has now authorized and instructed USDA to forgive the direct loans and the guaranteed loans that those farmers have with USDA. So the foreclosure moratorium was sort of a temporary protection, and now this debt forgiveness will really be sort of transformational, where we were staring down the barrel of a gun of a situation where once again there was sort of another generation of Black farmers that were about to lose their land, because of all this discrimination for so many decades. When COVID hit, but the Black farmers were just less able than, right? It hit hard for everyone and it hurt everyone, but for these people were just on sort of less solid ground to start with. And so while about 12% of USDA farm loans are in default right now, 35% of those loans to Black farmers were in default. And so this debt forgiveness is really going to be a lifeline and a lifesaver for those farmers. The third thing that the bill would do is it would attempt to restore the land base that's been lost. And so it would create a land grant program where USDA would give land grants of up to 160 acres to existing or aspiring Black farmers, and all kinds of other assistance to give them the opportunity to be successful and thrive. And the goal would be to try to create hundreds of thousands of new Black farmers on the land and sort of return them and restore that land base and try to sort of undo, we can never really undo the harm that's been done to those specific families over the decades, but to try to right that wrong to the best we can now. And then the last thing that bill would do is put systemic reforms in place that Senator Booker deeply believes are necessary to help all small farmers, where the current system is just so tilted towards these big multinational meatpacking companies and other consolidated companies that really have created a marketplace that's just not fair. There's no price discovery, and it's very one-sided and not fair and transparent. And so it would put those reforms in place. And so, I know we're going to have Q&A after I talk for a few more minutes, and so I'll stop there on describing the Justice for Black Farmers Act, but I'll end by saying it's a historic first step towards justice to have gotten this debt forgiveness. And it's not just the debt forgiveness. There's another $1 billion of assistance for Black farmers and other farmers of color in that COVID bill as well. So that but it's just a first step. And Senator Booker is going to be continuing to push to get the rest of the Justice for Black Farmers Act enacted into law. The second bill I want to tell you about is the Climate Stewardship Act. And the Climate Stewardship Act is a bill that Senator Booker reintroduced on Monday, and it is focused on what are known as natural climate solutions. And so we know that right now, climate change is just an existential threat that we need to deal with. And there's so many things that we need to do quickly to try to win this race and get to net zero emissions as quickly as possible and keep global warming, if in any way possible. Obviously, we need to keep it below 2 degrees, but really to keep it below 1.5 degrees if possible. And so the bill, natural climate solutions, right now in our country, our forests and our wetlands and our soil absorbs a little over 10% of all US emissions. But scientists have told us there's a potential for those for the forests and the wetlands and the soils to absorb a lot more if we invest in them. And so the bill would plant billions of trees, restore millions of acres of coastal wetlands, and invest heavily in farmers and ranchers as part of the solution to climate change through existing voluntary USDA conservation programs that would pay farmers to do the types of practices that the scientists are telling us are really important and beneficial from a climate change perspective, that will lead to healthier soils and more sequestration of carbon in the soil. And as much as the bill is important, the bill would reduce or offset the emissions from the agriculture sector by 1/3 in 5 years. And the billions of trees that would be planted would sequester billions of tons of carbon over their lifetime. So you'd have this sort of carbon sink going out to the end of the century. And it would actually be, it takes time from when you plant the trees until they're mature and they really are sort of at their maximum of carbon sequestration. So it's important from a climate change mitigation perspective to invest in these natural climate solutions to sequester all that carbon. But it's equally important as a climate change adaptation bill, as all the co-benefits that would come from those types of investments, because investing in our forests and our wetlands, the coastal wetlands are a big sponge. So when you have storms like Superstorm Sandy that just absolutely pummeled New Jersey and New York, we have filled in something like 90 or 95% of our coastal wetlands over the last century or two. And so we've lost that sponge, right? But if we were to restore millions of acres of coastal wetlands around our country, when there's big storms, it will reduce flooding and protect people. And the forests also sort of, when it rains, it absorbs the water, it reduces flooding, it protects drinking water, it creates millions of acres of habitat for endangered species and other wildlife. And the same thing with investing in farmers and ranchers as part of the solution to climate change, where it's important to sequester that carbon in the soil, but having that healthy soil makes the farms more resilient, makes the rural communities more resilient. It protects their drinking water. It reduces flooding. And so I think there tends to be a lot of focus on transitioning to clean energy away from fossil fuels and electrifying cars and trucks and buses, and all that is so important, and we have to do all of that. But one thing that we have to not forget, and that we have to also invest in, and that will really, there's no such thing as healthy people and an unhealthy planet, right? And unhealthy wildlife, as we're seeing from this pandemic. We need to sort of fundamentally change the way that we are interacting with nature and interacting with wildlife. And instead of destroying forests and destroying wetlands and farming in a way with so much chemicals that we're poisoning wildlife and killing all the pollinators, we need to really have regenerative agriculture, invest in our forests, invest in our wetlands. And so that's what this bill would do. And so I think with that, I'll pause, Pedro, and open it up to questions on either bill.
Great, thank you so much. Now, Mr. David Shilton, our Environmental Action Team convener, is going to sort of gather and proffer the questions from the chat. But I want to ask you, Adam, to start off with, can you please give us a sense of what is the legislative sort of landscape for these two bills? I've heard that we who care about the environment and the planet and its sustainability should be aware that elements from the CSA will be in the infrastructure package. So as we're thinking about how you can leverage our faith-based Morrell's voice on these two bills. Can you just give us a sense of how is the Justice for Black Farmers Act going to play out? What's the timeline? And then also, the same for the CSA.
So Justice for Black Farmers, as I mentioned, the debt forgiveness and other assistance was in the last reconciliation bill. A lot of what's left in Justice for Black Farmers may be more, we'll be looking for any vehicle to break off any piece of it that we can, but I think more likely for that, the rest of that bill is the next farm bill, which we'll start having hearings and working on probably next year, and the farm bill comes up in 2023. The Climate Stewardship Act, thank you for pointing out, Senator Booker's priority is to try to get as much of that as possible into this infrastructure Build Back Better climate change bill that the president has put out his sort of blueprint for, and that Congress is going to be working on in the coming months. And so I think having your voices help us stress the importance of sort of, caring for creation and investing in these natural climate solutions and making sure that they don't get sort of forgotten about and left on the cutting room floor, but that they end up in a substantial way, in that big bill that's going to come together.
Thank you. David?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Adam. Adam Wasserman has a very intriguing question to follow on to what you were just saying about the climate stewardship bill and whether parts of it might be put into the infrastructure bill. Have you heard anybody referring to, forests and wetlands as infrastructure? I mean, is there an argument that those should be considered infrastructure and get those into an infrastructure package?
I think there is this idea of green infrastructure, right? And of these types of investments as being important part of an infrastructure package. I think, when I was with Senator Booker when he was Mayor Booker in Newark, and there's a couple different ways that you could try to reduce stormwater runoff, right? You could build curbs and sort of hard infrastructure, or you could plant, right? And so I do think, especially given the expansive definitions we're hearing of infrastructure of late, I think these are not a difficult fit.
Great. Got an interesting question from Jan. It's our usual perception that, a lot of farmers in rural areas, we kind of look at them as sort of red state areas, fairly conservative views. What kind of education measures or other measures are needed to convince farmers to engage in carbon sequestration practices of the type that are forwarded in the Climate Stewardship Act?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the most exciting things about the bill. When we drafted it in 2019, we worked with farmers and ranchers on the bill, and ultimately the path that we went down and the way the bill is drafted, where the programs that we're putting billions of dollars more money in, the Conservation Reserve Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, the EQIP program, these are programs that the farmers are very familiar with. They like these programs, they're oversubscribed. And so it, I think, gives them a comfort level. And it's another reason why we don't necessarily have to just talk about it as carbon sequestration, right? It's about, if you do this, your farm, it's going to ultimately be in your bottom line interest to adopt these types of practices with the changing weather patterns and the extreme weather. And so we've been really excited that there's been a lot of support and no opposition that we've heard from farmers.
That's great. There's a question about, are there specific provisions in the Justice for Black Farmers Act that focus on climate? And also, I think a kind of a related question about Civilian Conservation Corps. And I know there's some provisions in both of those acts, so maybe you could address both of those questions.
Yeah, it's a great question, thank you. In the Justice for Black Farmers Act, we actually took some of the climate investments that we have in Climate Stewardship Act. We didn't take the whole bill and put it into Justice for Black Farmers, but we did take pieces of it and put it in there, and we gave priority for these enhanced dollars for the conservation programs. We gave priority for a portion of the money to Black farmers and other farmers of color, because in the past, they've gotten sort of disproportionately low amounts from these USDA programs. And so we want to make sure there's at least a set aside for them. And in the Climate Stewardship Act as well, we have set asides for socially disadvantaged farmers, for new and beginning farmers, to make sure that, you know, these dollars are flowing to them as well. And then in both bills, there's a type of civilian conservation corps. In the Climate Stewardship Act, it would be giving opportunities for young people, essentially training them and paying them to go plant trees and restore coastal wetlands. And in the Justice for Black Farmers Act, it would be a sort of on-farm apprenticeship program that USDA would create and be paying them to go work on small farms, get experience. And then for young Black people, if they then want to apply for a land grant, they would have priority.
We've had a couple questions about Native American farmers and are there provisions, and it sounds like there may be, that in the Justice for Black Farmers Act and perhaps the other act that would be of assistance to Indigenous farmers.
So there are a lot of provisions that benefit not just Black farmers, but Indigenous farmers as well. And we were, during our drafting process for the Justice for Black Farmers Act, we reached out to advocates for Indigenous farmers. They gave us really helpful feedback that we incorporated into the bill. Ultimately, the Intertribal Agriculture Council and the Native Farm Bill Coalition, they endorsed the bill. And so the set-asides that I was mentioning for the conservation programs in both bills, it's not limited to just Black farmers, but it's other socially disadvantaged farmers, such as Indigenous farmers, and there's a bunch of provisions. And the debt forgiveness that just passed and is now signed into law is not just Black farmers, but Indigenous farmers as well.
Great. There's a question about the existing farm subsidies, which are big. Is there a way to transition some of those to a different focus on climate? And would these bills help in any way on that score?
Yeah, so the approach that we took in the Justice for Black Farm, in the Climate Stewardship Act, with investing in these conservation programs, was that we didn't take the money from other programs, because every program has its supporters and would have, right? We like, in order to not create opposition for the bill, we didn't say we're going to take the money from crop insurance and put it over here. And that's part of the once in a generation opportunity we have for the Climate Stewardship Act. If we tried to get this type of increased funding for conservation programs in the next farm bill, it's a zero-sum game, right? There's a top line dollar amount, and we'd have to say where we're taking that money from. But in this big climate change bill, we don't have to do that. We're not taking it from somewhere else. It's just a new investment.
Gotcha. I see Rebecca has had her hand up. Rebecca, if you want to take yourself off mute and ask your question.
Oh, thank you very much. I wondered if you had heard of the Agricultural Fairness Alliance, who is working to help farmers transition. You know, they get bogged down when there's a big problem in their area, whether it's raising hogs or whatever it is, and they would like to transition, but really most of the funding and tax exemptions and subsidies are to continue what they're doing. Have you heard of that group? And
I have heard of them, and I think that what they're attempting to accomplish, and what it sounds like as you're describing it, and my recollection, is sort of to help facilitate farmers that want to transition, right, from the sort of current industrial model to a more regenerative model. And a bill that I didn't focus my remarks on, but sort of the third big bill in this space that Senator Booker has introduced in the last few years is called the Farm System Reform Act. And the Farm System Reform Act would put a moratorium on new large factory farms and would phase out large factory farms over time, but it would also create a $10 billion a year pot of money for voluntary, farmers who want to transition from this sort of industrial model to, more regenerative.
We have a question from Evelyn, who, as a small organic farmer, was destroyed by a big ag farmer who bought land next to her and removed every tree off the land. The land was poor and caused flooding. Is there any sort of protection in these acts that would help with that situation, or otherwise help small organic farmers like Evelyn?
So I think the bill would help Evelyn and farmers like Evelyn in a couple of ways, in the sense that Evelyn herself would be eligible for the increased conservation funding that we have. So to the extent that there are practices she's already doing or new practices that she would want to start doing, that having, you know, the USDA investment to cover those upfront costs, there'd be a lot of new dollars there for farmers like her. But then secondly, our hope is at the scale that we're proposing these investments, that the farmer next door to her might attempt to start planting cover crops or planting trees, and right, like that, like our goal is to get 100 million acres or more adopting these new conservation practices. And so hopefully it would just lead to sort of a better landscape all around, but there's no guarantee.
Right. And there are some provisions for helping with marketing for small organic farmers, for farmers markets and that sort of thing, as I recall.
Yeah, so there's a program that USDA currently has, that's the local agriculture marketing program, that's really a program designed to help facilitate and expand local and regional food systems. And that program currently gets $50 million a year, and the bill would increase it to $500 million a year. So we would give $5 billion over 10 years to just investing in that local and regional food system infrastructure, including, you know, farmers markets and everything, to try to just create that market for small farmers, organic farmers to sort of sell into. And
right, that's great. You know, USJ is going to be having some Hill meetings with Senate offices, and we'll be talking to quite a few people on the Senate Agriculture Committee, including a number of Republicans. How do we frame this effectively especially with Republican offices?
So I guess Senator Booker is now on the Senate Agriculture Committee, as some of you likely have read recently. The senator moved and is very excited to be able to sort of be at the table for as these issues are being debated and decided in the committee. And Senator Gillibrand, who's on the committee, has co-sponsored the bill. And I think as you're doing outreach, my expectation is that, because we're also starting to now reach out, starting with the Democrats on the committee, and I think our hope is that there'll be a lot of receptivity from the Democrats on the committee. On the Republican side, you know, there was a climate change hearing in the committee recently, and even the Republican witness talked about the need to invest in these existing voluntary USDA conservation programs and how important that is. And so I don't think there will be opposition to what's in the bill. I think the challenge with the Republican offices is going to be the price tag, right? Like the idea of spending a few $100 billion over 10 years to do things at the scale that we're proposing. I just think that's the challenge, right? Is just the pay for.
See, I think Sam has had his hand up for a while and had a couple questions in the chat. Sam, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much for this. It's just, I'm fascinated, and I'm wondering, do you see a connection? I go to these events and I start slowly making connections. Do you see a connection between Black farmers, Native food sovereignty, where our indigenous tribes all over this continent and the South American continent and the world are fighting to protect traditional foodways where we can just live on the food of the land, just as cultural traditional knowledge has taught, and the connection between those two things and the urban city communities' food sovereignty movements, which are in diverse, typically low-income, poor communities. Can you talk about that, if you've noticed any connections? And if you could drop in chat later those names, intertribal something, the two you consulted with, I'm really interested about that too. Thanks.
So I do think that they're connected, and I think that, you know, the reason that Senator Booker decided to come to the Senate Agriculture Committee, because it's not the most natural move for a senator from New Jersey, right? Like if you look at the committee and who it is, the Iowa senators and the Kansas senators, but the senator really realized that like food issues and farm issues are at the heart of so many of our country's problems, and that we really need to sort of transform the system. And I think that our indigenous farmers and our Black farmers and some of the urban farmers are really the sort of models that we need to be looking to as we try to transition away from this industrial farming system that's been created that really is hurting everyone, right? If you're Tyson or Smithfield or Cargill, the current system is great. But if you're essentially an independent family farmer, if you live in a rural community near one of these big industrial, factory farms, if you're a resident someplace like Newark, where Mayor Booker and I came from, where, the childhood obesity rates and the diabetes and the lack of access to fresh food. And so I think it is all very much connected. And I think that we need to be building coalitions to make change happen. And so Senator Booker's really hoping to be just working with all the advocates from all those places you mentioned.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question, Sam. Adam, I know you've got another commitment at 2:30, and we don't want to hold you beyond your time. This has been really informative and really helpful for our efforts here. And we're just really grateful for being here today and for all the help you've given USJ in the past. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for the support. And I think, we have an opportunity this year to get some really big things accomplished, but it's not going to happen by itself. And all of us pushing together, though, we can help to create transformative change. So thank you so much.
And we'll circle back to hear how the senator feels about the filibuster another time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Now, we're really excited to have Ben Thomas joining us. Ben is the Senior Policy Director for Agriculture at the Environmental Defense Fund, and he focuses on creating innovative and pragmatic solutions to address environmental risks from agriculture by working with key farm groups and policymakers across states and federal governments, the federal government. So he has an extensive background and experience working on both state and federal government matters to develop and implement policy related to food and agriculture. He understands the importance of strategic engagement with stakeholders, including farm groups, and to create programs that are effective and workable on the ground. So part of our thinking here was, Adam will give us the official line by the bill sponsors, but then we want to hear a little bit from somebody who's eyeballs deep in the policy and has a deep understanding of how the different players on the Hill interact with each other as they move legislation forward. So with that, I'd like to ask Paulette to spotlight Ben and allow us to hear and see him talking to us.
Thank you. Is my mic coming through okay?
It is. Thank you.
Good deal. First of all, thank you so much for convening this group and for having me. I was also really humbled to present alongside Senator Booker's staff. He has shown such great leadership in his tenure, and I know folks are really excited to have his perspective on the Ag Committee as well. Also really appreciate hearing the work that they've done on policies regarding Black farmers. This is such a critical area of focus, and it's long past overdue to address. Also really followed his comments on natural infrastructure. I'm relatively new to the Environmental Defense Fund, but we've done a ton of work on natural infrastructure and the potential there, not just when it comes to climate change, but when it comes to water quality, wildlife, and so many other things. So I'm learning as well, and really appreciate the opportunity to learn with you today. A bit more on the Environmental Defense Fund. We're a nonprofit environmental advocacy group. We work on issues like global warming, ecosystem restoration, oceans, and human health. We're nonpartisan and often advocate for market-based solutions to environmental problems. And I'll be honest, we really think outside the box when it comes to partnerships, which I'll get into later. That partnerships that may not necessarily be the effective towards not just advocating for what we believe is the best policy, but actually establishing in law good policy that has the broad support needed to endure the changing tides. A bit more on me, I grew up on a farm in the Texas Panhandle, cotton and peanut farm, although we're diversified and we'll grow whatever can survive the occasional hailstorm and a good sandblasting every few weeks. But my skill set didn't really match what it took to succeed there. And so I went to law school and found my way into ag policy. And it's been a remarkable journey. I spent years in DC working for the USDA, working on the Hill. In fact, I remember working for a previous senator on the Commerce Committee who sat next to Senator Booker. So I fondly remember him several years ago and just observing his pretty unique sense of humor. So going back really briefly on my career, and then we'll lead into policy. My entire career, I've focused on how can we enact policies that really improve life for the family farmer in America. And for most of my career, that meant things like crop insurance and disaster support and trade. And that worked for me well. I ended up moving to Montana. I became head of the Montana Department of Agriculture. And that ended up being a shift of not just, geography and the culture, but it represented a shift in my priorities. I moved there in 2017. It was a much drier than average year. There was beetle kill in the forests. And sure enough, that year, 1.4 million acres burned, the most on record for the state. Bizarrely, that moved into a worse than average winter. And then another drought year that was worse than the last. And then another winter that was horrifically bad, both in intensity and duration. And that created flood problems the following year, even so that folks couldn't even get in the field to plant. Now, weather challenges are no stranger to anyone, especially a farmer. But my experience in those first few years with the extremes of weather conditions made me finally accept that not only is climate change an issue we need to be thinking proactively about, it's one it should be a priority for our public policy to address, to mitigate, and to provide adaptive solutions for, especially when it puts our food supply system at risk. And I won't go into the science behind that and the warming of the earth that has occurred and that we expect to occur, and how that will only increase if we don't begin to draw down the rate of greenhouse gases that are present in the atmosphere. And I'll get into policies that support that in a little bit. And I'll say it's changed drastically. When I was trying to be confirmed in Montana before the Senate, different parties. So I was appointed by a governor who was of a different party than the legislature that was going to vote whether or not I could do the job. I remember striking out climate change because I thought they're just not ready to have this conversation. And I need this job because I just moved a long way from Washington, D.C. And I put extreme weather instead and went on and was confirmed. Just a few years later, the tone has changed. There is bipartisan support for action when it comes to climate change. There are folks on both sides of the aisle who want to have a dialogue, and that dialogue is sincere, and they want to see policies that aren't just talking points, but that actually make a difference. And that's what I'm here to discuss. And I'm really grateful for EDF. I mentioned before on the value of partnerships. When I was young working on the farm, I was always taught to work your hardest, but don't be afraid to ask a neighbor for help if you need it. And if a neighbor asks for help, lend a hand if you can. That applies in farm policy as well. And that's why we initiated the Food and Ag Climates. It's an alliance of farmers, forest owners, the food sector, state governments, and environmental advocates who set out last year with the goal of coming to consensus on policy recommendations to address climate change. No doubt it's an unlikely group in many respects, includes some heavy hitters with the farm groups, several commodity groups joined as well. And we've recently added the university systems that support our ag research and the Farm Credit Administration, just to name a few. It's a really diverse coalition. We've also recently brought in a Southern cooperative to represent Black farmers as well. I joined late in the game and I can't take credit for what they built at all, but I can certainly recognize the tenacity behind their intentions. Sure enough, last year they reached 27 specific recommendations to Congress. And very briefly, these are the 4 areas they're in. Say between crop insurance and our farm programs and soil health, we want to make sure our public policies do support soil health. We want to look at capacity for building soil health strategies at the state level. We want changes to USDA to enhance their work on mitigating greenhouse gases and allowing our producers to adapt to the changes. And then the big one, which I want to speak to, is we support a menu of voluntary policy options to encourage reducing levels of greenhouse gases, including by supporting the carbon credit markets. And this is kind of a new and emerging field, and that's why I wanted to chat with you about. Several of these other ideas, they're not new, they kind of speak for themselves. And I'll note that EDF, we always have a preference for relying on voluntary incentive-based pathways to encourage climate smart ag rather than burdensome regulation. This sometimes requires investment in public funds, but these approaches are much more likely to succeed politically. And they're also much more likely to be timely implemented and broadly adopted. All of this in a context where we don't have any more time to waste on this issue. And so I want to spend some time on that 4th point, which is private sector markets and carbon bank, and then we can have some discussion on all this. I'm not sure what the level of knowledge is on the carbon markets, but I'll just speak to it just a little bit here. It's not really new ground, but it's shaky ground for sure. And at the high level, this is kind of what it is. As governments worldwide have enacted laws to reduce atmospheric greenhouse gases, there are frameworks that allow large emitters to pay others to reduce their emissions or sequester carbon, either because it's cheaper than doing it themselves or because it takes time to transition their businesses and the economies they are a part of to really meet these established targets, which are in some cases very, very aggressive. That can be controversial at times, no doubt. And my sense is that the more aggressive you set those targets, the more we need to have some flexibility and opportunity to allow them to work with others who can be more aggressive. If we're less aggressive about those targets, maybe those flexibilities aren't important, but on the other hand, we also won't meet those goals as quickly as possible. So there definitely are pros and cons to each. My interest in this is clear. As this develops, the large emitters may have an interest in paying farmers for good farm practices. That to me means an additional revenue stream for family farms who may be looking for it. And to others, that means another avenue to draw down greenhouse gases, and one that may include co-benefits to rural communities, wildlife, soil health, or other things. And certainly carbon sequestration is a piece of this, and there may be a great deal of potential in sequestering carbon in ag lands, but how that actually pans out on a specific project is going to vary farm to farm. So I think it's important to emphasize that other greenhouse gases are included in this, such as nitrogen from fertilizer or methane from livestock operations. What excites me in these areas is we've been doing work with producers and dairies on approaches that can be effective here that don't just provide the opportunity to monetize these reductions in emissions that have good climate benefits, but they may have other benefits as well, such as decreasing input costs when it comes to nitrogen. We know there's, in some cases, over application of fertilizer. We want to help those producers better optimize what they're putting into the ground so that there's less of it running off and harming the atmosphere. Now, the US has largely avoided or deferred that strict regulatory approach other countries are taking. I'm not speaking positively to negative or negatively about that. That's not my role. I'm just observing what's kind of developed. Some states have, California to a degree, in the Northeast, there's consideration of a regulated market. And what we're now seeing is private entities are also jumping into the game, believing they can either work with those existing markets or they're recognizing the consumer interest in this as well. So in this state of play, our alliance recommended a role for USDA to support developing these markets so that we can improve the situation with the climate. And as co-chair of the Carbon Bank Working Group, that's kind of what I'm full-time focused on right now. And in our kind of comprehensive fact-finding strategy, I'll say we all had a different view of what we set out to do in all this. And our thinking evolved quite a bit as we realized how little knowledge we had to start with. And we're not there yet on specifics, but there's a couple principles I wanted to leave you with. First, with credit to the innovators who have developed the programs and the protocols that are out there. This is an area with so many scientific unknowns. And if we want to take this to take off, we need a comprehensive strategy to understand the various protocols, maybe even connecting them, because we want to maintain confidence of both the producers and the buyers of credits that they do, in fact, represent a drawdown in the greenhouse gases. We're not just looking for a talking point that someone can say, look at what I'm doing, this is good, and you should support me. We want what they're doing to actually reduce greenhouse gases and slow the rate of warming over time. That's fundamental for these markets to work. Consistency is important as well, but we also can't let that drive for consistency undermine the science underlying our goal. So we support these markets, but we want them to be as best as possible. Second, just right on President Biden's buzz on infrastructure. In order to achieve these goals, we must envision what critical climate infrastructure is or should be and invest in it. I certainly can't take on defining that right now, but as we are thinking broadly, we need to invest in research. We need capacity for technical assistance so that we can teach producers how to take on these new farming approaches or adopt these new developing technology. Thirdly, and I view this as both a noble goal in its own right, but also something that will broaden support and overcome political or ideological opposition, we must think broadly and inclusively about how to develop and deploy all of this. And that's no easy task. Senator Booker is clearly at the head of this. Ag operations can vary widely, as do rural communities, and certainly all of our country relies on our food system. And we need folks at the table as this develops with diverse inputs, with diverse ideas, because if we keep developing transformative public policy without a robust accounting of benefits and burdens, it'll lead to additional problems that will undermine our efforts entirely. So how does all this connect with what's going on in DC? Several pieces of our recommendation are possible in current authority, and we're advocating for the Biden administration to adopt some of those ideas. There are also a few bills going on, and then I'll wrap it up so we have time to discuss. What we're supporting is the Climate Solutions Act, the Growing Climate Solutions Act. And I can type that in the text box later. It should be introduced either today or next week, we're hoping. And I anticipate some last minute changes to it, and I think we'll support, but the general ideas in line with what we've talked about is we want to allow USDA to set minimum standards that are sufficient to ensure the integrity of these markets, and allow producers to meet those standards and ideally find a path forward towards participating in this marketplace. It deals with important things like carbon sequestration, emission reduction, livestock emissions, energy production on farm, forests as well, which is not my expertise, but is an important piece of that. And it requires USDA to set standards on key areas that we believe are fundamental. And these are concepts of quantification, verifiability, additionality, and permanence. I can't go into all of that right now, but these are kind of the scientific, it's the heart of this system to work that we really need to be there. And it maintains the voluntary approach. And I'll leave that at some other farm bill programs we support, and looking forward to seeing good policies on those to help improve them and fund them better over time. I'll just say last, try to leave conversations like this from a very positive place, because I am really positive in this space. I've been in heated political negotiations over time, and but through this FACA group, which is completely bipartisan, we really are in a moment, and we're in a moment where we are unified and seeing a pathway towards addressing climate change, not through costly regulation, but by connecting folks who want to pay producers to change their practices on their farm, maintain their family farms, continue to be productive, but to contribute positively to the climate situation. There will be agreements, disagreements along the way, but I think this is worth a hard, sincere look with open eyes, and that's all I have to ask of you today. I know there were a lot of questions in the chat box, and I haven't been able to read through them all, so I hope I didn't stir anyone up too much.
Thank you
Well,
so
thank
much,
you.
Ben. David's going to review the chat and proffer the questions just as we did with Adam, but I'd like to lead off with two things. First off, I applaud your strategy of always including the stakeholders and especially the users of the natural resource. I know I reflect upon my own work in the case of Puerto Rico's Vieques, and getting any work forward without including the fishermen that were residents to the island was nearly impossible. So I think that's an important element as we try to include the impacted communities in whatever environmental strategies we're putting forward. But second, I wanted to invite you to make a comment about Adam's articulation of the sort of the timetable. You know, a lot of the folks on this call will be looking to get involved with and through UUSJ on these bills. And just, can you give us, you know, do you want to add anything to what he said about the timeline for the Justice and Black Farmers Act, and especially the CSA? And in general, is there something you want us to know as we're rolling into this work as a community of faith in faith-based actors?
My sense is that there is a strong appetite on the Hill for engaging on these policies, but in order for them to do that, we need the pressure. We need them feeling the same feeling that I know I have, and I think you have, which is we can't wait another year, or we can't wait for another Congress. We need to start moving on these issues. That being said, some of these, you may be familiar with the Farm Bill and that process, and it's every 5 years. And some, I know there are some who want to wait for the next Farm Bill for certain of these pieces. I don't know where everything falls, but I do think things will happen in short order, whether or not that's all of these pieces, and some of it may be deferred to the Farm Bill. I don't know.
Thank you. David, questions from the chat?
Great, yeah, and so for a lot of people had questions for Adam. I wasn't able to get to them all. So if you had one for Adam that you think that Ben might be able to speak to, go ahead and raise your hand virtually. And I'm going to start with John Peterson, who I know had one and would like to ask you one, Ben. Go ahead and unmute, John.
Yeah, Ben, are you familiar with the Justice for Black Farmers and Climate Stewardship Act?
I am, yes.
Okay, so I was wondering, first of all, how much those would cost about?
How much what? I'm sorry?
How much they would cost? How many billions of dollars are we talking about?
I'm not sure exactly. I'm sorry. I'm familiar with the bill. I know we have we like a lot of what's in it. I'm not sure what the costs are on that.
Okay. I know Adam said 10% of emissions from the U.S. are currently offset by soil practices and forests. He said that could go higher, but he didn't say how much higher. Do you have a feeling for, you know, a sort of a range?
Yeah, that baseline is actually a really fundamental part of the research that we believe needs to be prioritized. And this is a difficult thing to do because, as you know, our land, no acre in the United States is similar to another acre. Soil has varying levels of potential for sequestering carbon, and we differentiate carbon in things like methane. Folks are often focused more on how we can sequester more, but the less we emit when it comes to methane, methane is much more potent as a greenhouse gas. And we also believe it's kind of the low hanging fruit when you look at various feed additives, when you look at various feeding practices, when you look at how manure can be dealt with in a different way. If we can stop those gases from ever being emitted, then we will be less concerned with how we can then sequester them later on. But as far as that potential, I think I'm as curious as you are because it will relate to the financial part of this, because we're kind of relying on that part of it to be what incentivizes these new practices. I know a lot of farmers, I'm from a farm family, folks are doing remarkable things on their lands, some are, and the only thing that is preventing them from doing even more is that it's a business, and there needs to be an incentive to go that extra mile.
Okay.
Thank you, Ben. Pamela has her hand up. Pamela, go ahead and unmute.
Hi, thank you so much for your good work. All of these are wonderful. I worry significantly about your supporting of carbon credit markets instead of direct fees that are revenue neutral, that get paid back to the people. Because that kind of solution not only engages the markets to work to reduce climate change, it also reduces economic inequality and supports the poor by making equal payments of the taxes get paid out in equal payments to everyone. And that benefits the marginalized communities the most. People of color, in Native Americans, so that it would hit the two biggest problems we've got: climate change and economic inequality.
Yeah. So I agree with a lot of where you are. And when I talk about carbon credits, I'm not talking about the tax system at all. What we're trying to do is provide an avenue for the market here to go directly to producers with as little going to the middleman as possible, and certainly the government.
You can't do that.
It's very difficult, and that's what we're trying to do. Our role in FACA is to say, okay, what are the barriers to participate in this market? We know people are participating in it, but we know it's not small producers. We know it's not historically disadvantaged producers. So we need to focus in on those issues and find out what public programs we can offer that will overcome some of those barriers for the socially disadvantaged, the historically underserved, the minority producers. And that's going to be at the foundation of what we recommend, I anticipate, in a couple of weeks. Because we don't want this to continue as our previous farm policy did, which is be something that is only promotes and accelerates inequality, and something that is not equitable. That is definitely not my goal. In fact, my interest is to focus on the opposite, which is how we can use this as an opportunity to bring some equity back into the conversation.
Do you not see that working better in direct taxes, fees that then get paid out people equally?
I might. The issue here, which kind of goes back to our kind of concept at EDF, is we have to focus on what is not just, in our view, the best environmental policy, but the one that has the broad support that's needed to become established and be enduring. And I think,
but it does, because it has Republican support. It doesn't grow government. Libertarian support. It makes the market work.
And that's what the approach we're taking here, which is to leave government as small as possible, allow these private markets to develop, but have our efforts focused on making sure that everyone can participate in those markets.
Have you looked at the Carbon Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act?
Thank you.
What do you think of that one?
I can't speak to that specific bill.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
For that, Ben. And there's a kind of a related question about biodiversity. You know, farmers know as well as anybody about the biodiversity crisis, especially those who rely on pollinators. Is there anything in any of these bills that would help with the great loss of biodiversity that's occurring by preserving the land that they need.
What we really love about many of these ideas is the co-benefits that I mentioned earlier. So if we're taking actions on working ag land that do sequester carbon, another benefit of that additional carbon in the soil is that it increases the soil quality. That same practice, which may be reduced tillage or no tillage, it may even be a land retirement, either temporary or long-term. All of that is going to have other co-benefits, including habitat, including water quality. And we're definitely taking that kind of comprehensive view, understanding that all of this is important, but like the short term, like right now, that I believe is really, really important, is that we draw down those greenhouse gases, because the more we can draw down the earlier, the less the planet will warm. And that means the fewer climate disasters we'll see around the world.
Gotcha.
But yes, we support all of that.
I see Jan has his hand up, but Jan, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, I'm Jan Dash, editor of the Climate Encyclopedia. I have a question about your carbon credit program. One of the experiences of cap and trade programs like the ETS market in Europe is that they had to basically revamp the initial system because the price was way too low, on the order of less than 10 euros a ton, and they had to put higher floors on, which raised the prices up about $40 now, or 40 euros. And so my question is, to what extent is it practical, and to what extent do you support a floor on the price of your credits in order to make the program actually succeed in what you're trying to do?
That's a great question. And I cannot answer on behalf of EDF for this because it is something we're looking at as well. What we do know, as you referenced, the price for carbon is higher in regulated markets than it is in non-regulated markets. And I don't think in a voluntary market system that we'll ever get to a place where it's enough. So the question is, how can you support that price? One option that I know we heard about is that USDA could set a price floor by being a kind of buyer of last resort. So if someone is offering to take practices that sequester carbon, and we know that we can verify that, then USDA will purchase that, but not below a certain amount. There are a lot of complications in how you implement that, and I think we're really open to possibilities within that. The other possibility is a regulated market, and politically, I can't tell you what the possibilities of that are in the short or long term, but that's definitely one of the options.
There's a couple of questions about your coalition and whether it has connections with Indigenous and Black farmers.
Yep. So you can go on the FACA website, see the various members, and those like Farmers Union, for example, and Farm Bureau and commodity groups, they all have broad representation, but it's not targeted representation. That was our feedback to the group going in is I feel that I am not equipped to deal with the very real issues that others are facing, including Black and Indigenous farmers. I would rather hear from people who have those experiences rather than me try and determine and then tell them what those issues are. So we've been doing aggressive outreach, and we recently brought on the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. They have done remarkable work in this space. I think they just joined 2 or 3 weeks ago and are now getting involved in our weekly meetings, and we're very grateful to have their leadership. We're working with them on a kind of pilot proposal that I referenced on how we can work specifically with minority and disadvantaged farmers to help them as well.
Great.
I'll type this in the chat.
Great.
Federation of Southern Cooperatives.
And there was also a question about, meat and dairy have a big climate impact, especially methane emissions. Are they part of the coalition, and are they working towards some solutions of those problems?
You said dairy?
Meat and, yeah, dairy.
Yeah, well, with dairy, we've done amazing work, and I have to say they came to us recently and said, by the way, our board just voted unanimously to support a net zero policy, and it blew me away because you haven't heard many other ag industries say, yeah, I don't care what's going on over here. Here's what we've committed to that's beyond anything that you're discussing over there. And so we're working with them on what that'll actually look like. And it's going to take investment. It's going to take some compromise, some growing pains. But we want to help them get to their net zero. I should say it's not just net zero, it's net zero or more. In other words, how can the dairy industry as a whole become a net sink for carbon, essentially. And one piece of this that we're looking at, I mentioned the methane before, there's a couple options there. There's some emerging feed additives that could be included in the feed supply that will just simply mean that each cow is emitting less methane. But there's also ways that we can work on the manure management side of it as well. And going back to the representation, this invites some really tough issues on environmental justice. And we can't ignore those problems any longer. We need to consider the community impact these operations have and be creative about how we can hopefully overcome some of these issues. But at the same time, biogas operations, especially if we can make them work for small operations and not just large operations, that could make a difference. But we have a lot of work we need to do on that. And I also want to say that both dairy and beef are members of this alliance as well, that are at the table negotiating.
Great. Well, we've taken more of your time than we'd actually promised. We really appreciate that. Pablo, did you have any thing you wanted to bring up with Ben before we get on to sort of the